David, and as you mentioned, today in Israel, it's Memorial Day, where we mourn the deaths of our fallen soldiers, victims of terror, and tomorrow evening we'll celebrate the 70 years of independence. And so it's in a very timely manner that we're here to discuss undoubtedly Israel's potential enemy number one, and more particularly its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which continues to destabilize the Middle East by arming, training, and directing terrorist proxies all around the region. In recent months, the EU and the UK have considered designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization, also in response to Iran's transfer of killer drones to Russia, brutal internal repression, destabilizing operations all over the Middle East, and operating terror cells in Europe. To discuss this complex issue, we are glad to have today a strong advocate for the UK to proscribe the IRGC, Kasra Aarabi, who is the Iran program lead at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, where he specializes in Iran and Shia Islamist extremism. He's also a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Aarabi is a native Persian, Farsi speaker, and holds an MA in International Relations and a BA in International Relations, both from King's College in London. He's pursuing a PhD currently in the University of St. Andrews, where his research focuses on Iran's Revolutionary Guard, which is very relevant to today's discussion. So first things first, we've also heard today, let's start. Last week, 125 MPs in the UK, cross-parliamentarians, sent a letter to the UK Prime Minister urging him to proscribe the IRGC. And today, we've heard the UK, the US, and the EU sanctioning more entities in Iran for human rights violations, including IRGC members. If we maybe help us, Kasra, to start, but what is the IRGC and which countries have proscribed them and why?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak, Daniel, and to FELNET. As you said, it's a very, very timely discussion on the IRGC and on Iran policy more broadly. It's a very important question. And this is actually key to the prescription of the IRGC. We have to define it. The IRGC, first of all, we have to make it absolutely clear whenever we talk about the Guard, it is not a conventional state armed force. It began as an Islamist militia, and it's maintained that militia identity through the way it behaves. So according to the Islamic Republic's constitution, its 1979 constitution, which is still in place today, the IRGC is an, quote, ideological army with an ideological mission to wage jihad in God's path as a means to spread Sharia around the world. So that's the exporting the Islamic revolution abroad. At home, the IRGC's purpose, its primary mission, is to enforce the clergy's hardline Islamist order on the Iranian people. And when it began as essentially the clergy's bodyguard, and it's expanded since then. Beyond Iran's borders, it is to export the Islamic revolution with the goal of creating a pan-Islamist state centered on Ayatollah Khamenei's leadership as the deputy of the 12th Imam. So according to Shia doctrine, the 12th Imam, the 12th divinely ordained Shia Imam and descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, was withdrawn into occultation in 874 AD, and one day he will return. And when he returns, he will bring justice around the world. The IRGC's purpose is to spread that revolution as a means to prepare for Mahdi's return. And we can discuss this militaristic doctrine of Mahdiism because it's basically become one of the most important doctrines of the IRGC's indoctrination, and it is the single biggest threat to Israel's existence, and I can elaborate on that more broadly. So the IRGC is an ideological organization, and it recognizes itself as that. It behaves and operates like all other violent Islamist extremist organizations that are prescribed, from Hezbollah to Al-Qaeda to ISIS. How so? Well, first of all, indoctrination. Radicalization is absolutely central to the IRGC's DNA. It enforces radicalization and indoctrination as part of its program. of ideological political training, and indoctrination now makes up for more than 50% of the IRGC's training. So overall training, alongside military training, more than 50% of that now is radicalization. So then the key question is, well, what are they teaching their recruits? I have had access and have analyzed the internal training manuals the IRGC uses to indoctrinate its recruits. And it calls explicitly on its recruits. By the way, this is indoctrination for the members and their families, and it's all compulsory. Now, they are calling and teaching their recruits to wage jihad on Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians because, quote, they have unacceptable faith, and in the end, they must either convert to Islam or they must be executed. For Iranians who oppose the Islamic Republic, they are teaching their recruits that these Iranians are muharibs. They are waging war on God and therefore must not only be executed, but must be tortured prior to their execution. And they outline the method of torture, cross amputation, etc. And if you go back to the November, the protests, in the peak of the protests in November, the Islamic Republic started executing Iranian youth on the basis that they were waging war on God, and we had reports coming out that they had been tortured in the most horrific ways. So indoctrination, like other terrorist organizations, is absolutely key. Now, how are they putting this into practice? Well, if we look at the modus operandi of the IRGC, it doesn't, again, behave like a conventional armed force. That's why, by the way, its budget is incomparable. It's not spending that much on its military because its military is insurgency. Its style, insurgency is a relatively low-cost method of warfare. Terrorism, militancy, hijackings, hostage takings, they are the modus operandi of the IRGC. For the past more than 44 years since its inception, the IRGC has been directly involved in terrorist operations, and it has created some of the most deadly terrorist organizations in the world. From Hezbollah, for example, which was created by the IRGC. Its charter was written by Hossein Dehghan, who was Hassan Rouhani. Remember Hassan Rouhani, the so-called reformist? He was Hassan Rouhani's defense minister.
The moderate.
The so-called moderate. So everything about the IRGC is emblematic of a terrorist organization. The verse above the IRGC's logo, which is very similar to that of Hezbollah's, the verse is a Quranic verse, which is the most cited Quranic verse used by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So the similarities between the IRGC and other prescribed terrorist organizations, both in the way it functions, behaves, and operates, are unparalleled. And that's why the IRGC should be on the UK's designation list, the UK's list of terrorist organizations.
So with that brilliant and most beautiful CV you've just mentioned about the IRGC and described it quite well, then why isn't it yet? Why is it so complicated? And what are the, let's say, the benefits and the drawbacks for a country such as the UK or even the EU or a bigger international organization to simply prescribe such a dangerous organization?
Sure. So, to be honest, the arguments against, in my opinion, are unconvincing. Those who are against prescription claim that it's merely symbolic and existing sanctions on the IRGC suffice. And that's not true. Prescription would equip governments with the tools, the appropriate tools they lack to deal with the IRGC terror threat, which is a direct threat to UK and Europe's national security. Now, in the past few years, particularly in the past year, the IRGC has doubled down on its efforts to nurture homegrown Islamist terrorism and homegrown Islamist radicalization, using methods that we've seen ISIS and Al-Qaeda use. So through the dissemination and propagation of violent Islamist extremist propaganda, both on the online space and at its centers, at its mosques, at its schools, etc., across Europe and the UK. Now, after the attack on Salman Rushdie, after the terrorist attack on Salman Rushdie, we saw the IRGC again double down on this effort to nurture homegrown Islamist extremist radicalization. They were pretty open about that. Following the attack, a senior member of the Islamic Republic's Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, said that we no longer need to send IRGC recruits to terrorize individuals like Bolton or Pompeo, when we have zealous youth in these countries that we can equip to carry out our mission for us. Similarly, after the caricature, Charlie Hebdo drew a caricature of Ayatollah Khamenei during the peak of the protests, the IRGC's commander-in-chief, Hossein Salami, responded by saying that the editors of Charlie Hebdo would face the same consequences, the same fate as that of Salman Rushdie by the zealous Muslim youths in these countries. Now, you put all of this against the backdrop of rising IRGC violent Islamist extremist propaganda activity in the UK, and we've seen a significant rise in that, and I can outline some of them, then it becomes particularly worrying. In July 2022, so last July, an IRGC-related propaganda anthem, Salute Commander, was recorded at the Islamic Republic of Iran school and the premises of the Islamic Centre England, which is the Islamic Centre of England is a UK-registered charity that operates as the official office of Ayatollah Khamenei in London. Now, Salute Commander was a IRGC-affiliated anthem, specifically designed, by the way, to radicalize children. In the anthem, it's been translated to multiple languages and it's been recorded across the West, including in Paris and in London. In the song, children, and I mean children, they're not teenagers, they're young children, they declare their willingness to become martyrs in the path of the 12th Imam, and their willingness and their preparedness to join the 313. Now, the 313 is part of the militaristic doctrine of Mahdiism. It goes, according to Shia doctrine, when Mahdi arrives, he will return with 313 special commanders. And these special commanders will go to war with the non-Muslims. Prior to his arrival, there will be a war with the Jewish state, and the Shias will eradicate Judaism and the Jewish people from this earth. According to this doctrine of Mahdiism, which is referred to in this anthem, this is the biggest barrier. Israel's existence is the biggest barrier to the return of Mahdi. Now, existing sanctions on the IRGC, this is just one incident, by the way. We've had multiple incidents.
Right.
A few weeks ago, the Islamic Centre of England, again, was glorifying martyrdom in the path of God. This is a centre, by the way, that's had links to the IRGC.
What do you make of the? Yeah, no, go ahead. So, like, what in the matters of sanctions today?
Yes. So this is the key point. Existing sanctions on the IRGC do not prohibit the dissemination and propagation of IRGC violent Islamist extremist propaganda. So that's a loophole. Existing sanctions do not prohibit that. That's why terrorist legislation is so important. While the IRGC is taking advantage of this, the IRGC is pushing to nurture homegrown radicalization on British soil. And at the moment, our sanctions regime doesn't cover that. The only thing that would equip the British government, the Charity Commission, and technology companies with a clear mandate to impose an outright ban on any content or any activity affiliated to the IRGC is terror legislation. And that's why, in my opinion, that is the most convincing reason why the IRGC should be prescribed, because it equips government with the right tools. It also provides them with the right tools for preventative steps. So if you look at the PREVENT program in the UK, or if you look at the PREVENT program, similar ones in Europe, in the European Union and in Germany, it only covers Sunni Islamist extremism, particularly Salafi jihadism. At the moment, Shia Islamist extremism is not covered.
So in a more global way, if we prescribe the IRGC in the UK today, or let's say in the EU, which will be obviously a bit more dramatic and bigger because of all the countries that it involves, what's the impact on the group's, let's say, funding, financing, indoctrination, or like propaganda? How will it impact it? Will it be so impactful that it will actually change How so?
Yes. Well, first of all, when we talk about terrorist legislation, the first and primary objective here is the protection of UK or European citizens. That's why terrorist legislation is so important. So it protects UK citizens, European citizens from the threat of IRGC terrorism. Why? Because it equips government with the right tools, as I said, a mandate to ban any activity related to the IRGC, and also to the right preventative steps to mitigate against Shia radicalization or IRGC radicalization. The same way they would for Hezbollah. For example, we've got Hezbollah on the list now in the UK. We've got in its entirety, which is
Right.
the absolute correct decision. But that decision was made as a means to impose maximum restraint on the Hezbollah's ability to raise funds, and also to prevent Hezbollah's ability to spread its jihadi propaganda with the goal of obviously recruiting and radicalizing people abroad. All those efforts are undercut when its father, the IRGC, which is still its primary supporter financially, militarily, logistically, and ideologically, is not on the list, is freely operating in that regard. So in terms of impact, first and foremost, and the primary targets, by the way, of IRGC terrorism in Europe, the first is the Iranian diaspora, and the second is the Jewish community. They're the two primary targets here. And this is, as a member of the Iranian diaspora, I know, having talked to the British Iranian community, for example, that they don't feel safe on the streets of London. They no longer feel safe, which is remarkable to say. I've also had conversations with the Jewish community, and ditto. They do not feel safe. Why? Because you have some of the most extreme ideological organizations present here on British soil, some of which have direct ties to the IRGC. So again, that prescription, first and foremost, it protects against terrorism, it protects the citizens of Britain or Europe, etc. The secondary, sure.
Go ahead, no, please.
No, I was going to say the secondary impacts. These are the non-political. These are the non-political impacts and objectives of why terrorist legislation is important. The second, if you like, political objective is to put maximum cost on any affiliation with the IRGC inside of Iran. Now that has two goals. The first is to deter future would-be recruits from entering the IRGC. And the second is to put maximum pressure to ensure its existing members begin to defect. You make the IRGC so toxic, which it is, recognizing that it is one of the most deadly terrorist organizations in the world.
Right.
And you impose that maximum cost so as to start to affect its internal structures.
Right. And then definitely. So how does the prescription of the IRGC, for example, if we take it back to more locally to Israel, how do you think, what will be the impact on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Israeli borders? As we know, because Iran is very much involved with Hezbollah and Hamas all around its borders. If a country such as the UK prescribes the IRGC, what will be the impact on that?
Well, I think we are entering a very dangerous phase in this conflict the Islamic Republic has with the state of Israel. All the signs indicate that Ayatollah Khamenei and the IRGC are preparing to escalate. They already have begun this process of escalation, and that it's only going to get worse. Now, we can tell this because inside that small circle, Khamenei's small circle, and that of the core IRGC elites, they genuinely believe that Israel and the US-led order is in decline. Now, it sounds ridiculous, at least the part about Israel's decline. Now, there is a broader debate as to whether US disengagement from the Middle East we are entering a multipolar world. But if we take these two beliefs, they genuinely believe Israel's in decline and the US-led order is in decline. Now, as ridiculous as this may sound, it's also extremely dangerous. Why? Because if they believe Israel and the US order is in decline, they will try and speed up that process. Now, that will result in escalations, anti-West, anti-Israel escalations. It will lead to recklessness and strategic errors on their part, and this includes recklessness in relation to the nuclear and terrorism files when it comes to the Islamic Republic. Their full support for Putin's war in Ukraine suggests this recklessness has already begun. And that's, by the way, the prism, this viewing these two issues in decline, that also informed, that was the primary reason as to why the Islamic Republic decided to go along with this China brokered agreement with peace, normalization with Saudi Arabia. So that's the primary motivation for the Islamic Republic. It's not peace, it's the opposite. It's the opposite to peace.
And if I'm not mistaken, the Saudis have prescribed the IRGC, right?
The Saudis have taken actions, measures on prescription against the IRGC. Bahrain has, Canada has in part, and obviously the US has. Again, that decision, and there are two ways, by the way, when we talk about Europe. There is member states individually taking that decision. That's probably the simplest way, because to get European Union, you have to have a collective decision. But it's very likely, for example, if Germany prescribes, a lot of other European states will follow. Similarly, if the UK prescribes, you will see other states begin to follow. That's the most effective way to get prescription over the line. And as I said, we are on the verge of entering a very, very dangerous territory when it's in relation to IRGC terrorism.
So obviously, as we mention every time, and we see it on the news every day, there's a war in Europe as well. Like obviously, there's the war in Ukraine. How involved is the IRGC? Iran, we know that are selling weapons to Putin, and then they are being used in Ukraine. How involved is specifically the IRGC in the war in Europe?
Yeah, very involved. Very involved. You have IRGC drones now targeting Ukrainian civilians. You have IRGC drones being fired in Europe. 2 years ago, European Union policymakers could get away with saying it's an issue far away from us. It's in the Middle East, it's far away from us. And there was a clear gap, by the way, between the US approach,
right,
in both administrations, by the way, the former administration and this administration. There was still a gulf between US and Europe's policy when it comes to the Islamic Republic, when it comes to Iran, because when it came to regional issues, the European approach was, it's far away. Now it's in our borders. Now it's in our territory. So not only are we seeing IRGC terrorism taking place on our soil, we're seeing IRGC drones being fired into European territory. This is only going to increase. If we go back to what I just said about the Khamenei and the IRGC viewing the US-led order in decline and it being intent to speed that up, that's what shaped the calculus in Tehran to go all out and fully support militarily Putin. They view this as Khamenei views this for a civilizational lens. He believes that the West, there is a clash of civilizations between Islam and the West. And he is trying to take it for the first time. He's taking he sees an opportunity, and he's now expanded this clash of civilizations and said, on the one hand, you've got the Western civilization, and opposing it, you have the Islamic civilization headed by Khamenei. You have the Russo-Slavic civilization headed by Putin, and the Chinese headed by Xi Jinping. They're all in one camp. That's what Khamenei believes, by the way. Whether or not China or Russia genuinely believe in this kind of troika is neither here nor there.
It's good enough for him.
It's good enough for Khamenei.
Before I ask you the next question, I just want to remind all of our guests, if they want to submit any questions through the Q&A, feel free to do so. So as you said, the regional issues are now getting closer to the other ones. So let's jump to another one, the nuclear folder. And Iran is now very close to enriching enough uranium to be able to build a bomb. One of the reasons that we hear the excuses, as you mentioned them, to not prescribe the IRGC is to not do steps to anger the regime in Tehran in order for negotiations to potentially evolve in a positive way. And we've heard recently that maybe the US wants to bring back the JCPOA, etc. Where do you put all of this together? Is a nuclear agreement connected to the IRGC? Is a nuclear agreement possible? Where do you put this in all this context?
Yeah, it's a very good question. All of these issues are connected. All of these issues are connected. Let's go back to JCPOA original. By the way, I think the JCPOA was negotiated in good faith on the Western side, on the US side, on the European side. I think it was in good faith. I think they were completely where their thinking was completely misaligned to where the Islamic Republic was thinking on this issue, and they couldn't have been further. But at least on the West side, I believe it was negotiated in good faith. But you cannot separate these issues, because what happened was, the thinking behind the JCPOA was you integrate the Islamic Republic into the international system, you lift sanctions, you have a thaw in relations, and the Islamic Republic will moderate its behavior because it no longer feels threatened. The opposite turned out to be true. When we saw sanctions that were eased, and we have research to back this up with the evidence, as sanctions were eased on the Islamic Republic, we saw a surge in the number of IRGC manufactured militias. These are the most deadly form of militia. The IRGC not only arms them and trains them, it spends a lot of resource on indoctrinating them. So we saw an expansion of IRGC militias in the region. We also see the IRGC's footprint expand in the Middle East, and we see a rise in IRGC terrorist operations in Europe. So, and we see an escalation in ballistic missile activity, etc. So you can't detach these two issues. You need a much more
causation and
approach.
correlation.
Absolutely. So the issues are related, but one of the flaws with the JCPOA was that it didn't understand the way the Islamic Republic behaves and how Khamenei operates his foreign policy. Khamenei has a dual foreign policy approach between Maydun and diplomacy. Maydun is effectively battlefield militancy, and diplomacy is diplomacy. The JCPOA, the West, only engaged with diplomacy. That left the militancy completely unchecked. And that's why they felt they had the free rein to do everything. They used the JCPOA as a bargaining chip. Each time the Islamic Republic would step out of line, each time it committed an act of terror or escalated in the region, they would use the threat of walking away from the JCPOA as a bargaining tool. And that worked. Right. Look, it's clear that the Biden administration has, and whether we agree or disagree, I'm not here to state a position on that, even though I think my views are very clear on the JCPOA. It didn't work. But the Biden administration has made it very clear that it has, since it's come into the White House, tried relentlessly to engage the Islamic Republic. Khamenei is not interested in a deal. This is where we get into dangerous territory. Khamenei's regime closely observed what went on in Afghanistan. They genuinely believe, Khamenei and the IRGC, that the US is not interested in any form of confrontation in the region. They believe that the US wants to withdraw from the region. They're trying to speed that up, both in terms of militancy and through diplomatic agreements, getting China to still fill that vacuum. And it's been pressing, it's been escalating, and it hasn't had a response. Put simply, Khamenei believes that, and the circle around Khamenei believe that they can get away with pretty much anything at the moment, cost-free, without fear of consequence. That has, because they believe that if a Republican enters the White House, the policy will change. That has led to a belief, or at least talk, within the circles of Khamenei and the IRGC, that now may be the best opportunity to push for the, quote, North Koreaization of the nuclear program. So we're entering dangerous territory. We have sunset clauses coming into effect again in October this year.
But do you think a new deal is possible and relevant today?
I think that
with the Biden administration coming to an end and a potential Republican government coming in?
I think the JCPOA has long been dead. And I think there's been an unwillingness to think of a plan B. Now, whether that's because Europe has other issues that are more pressing, like Ukraine, whether it's trying to shift towards the Indo-Pacific. Look, you may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is always interested in you, and the Islamic Republic is not going anywhere. Insofar as the threat from the Islamic Republic is not going anywhere. The Achilles heel of the Islamic Republic, by the way, is the Iranian people. The Iranian people want this regime out more than anyone else. Yes, go on.
No, let's dig into that for a second, because we've saw what happened with Masha Amini, and we've seen the human rights violation sanctions that have been put on Iranian entities and also the IRGC. But what's the real impact on that? Because the Iranian people have, we discussed just before we started the call, the protests in 2019, but also the protests nowadays. What's the impact on the Iranian regime technically? Like,
sure. So the thing to note is, if we analyze the pattern of protests in Iran, we can see that protests are getting bigger in size, scale, and are becoming more frequent. As well as that, we can see that the regime is resorting to more violence to preserve the system. The latest round of protests, by the way, they haven't finished. The Iran revolution still continues. It has peaks and troughs. Sometimes it's on the surface, then it goes back into underground, and then it comes back up again. And we've seen that just a few weeks ago. The Iranian people were bravely out on the streets again. And the regime really is doing absolutely everything, horrific measures to clamp down, but that's not deterred the Iranian people, particularly the Iranian youth. They are not going away. And I've spoken to some of the protest leaders, underground protest leaders, and they tell me that, you know, they are not concerned. The people will always take to the streets. They're going to stay on the streets. So, you know, the Iranian people are not going anywhere.
So what can Europe do in order to support these protesters?
Sure.
Is prescribing the IRGC something that will completely change the...
It won't completely change the calculus, but we're at a stage now where we know the Iranian people have explicitly made their demands clear. They're not calling for reform. They are calling for the outright collapse of the Islamic Republic in its entirety. That's the Iranian people have made their demands clear. The past 30 years have shown that the Islamic Republic cannot be reformed. And I think that message has finally been acknowledged in the West. There is no such thing as reformists in the Islamic Republic. This was a game by Khamenei, one that he created to first give hope of false liberalization to the Iranian youth in the early 1990s with the student protests, and second, to fool the West into giving it more concessions to alleviate pressure on its economy. But the Iranian people have made the message clear, and that's not going away. So that's here to stay. Now, the next stage is it largely relies on external policy. How can the West, how can Europe, how can America weaken the Islamic Republic and support the Iranian people simultaneously? The first step is to take a step back and carve a policy that's designed, draw a distinction between the Iranian people and the Islamic Republic. And I will say here that Israel was probably one of the first states that have done this, and they've done it remarkably well. And that's credit to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They've been fantastic on this. They have made it absolutely explicitly clear that there should be a policy for the Islamic Republic and the Iranian people. Drawing that distinction is absolutely essential. There are multiple steps the West can take to support the Iranian people and weaken that repressive machinery. The first is targeting the ideological centers that are linked to the IRGC beyond Iran's borders, that sit in the West, that sit in London, that sit in across Europe. That's one method. The second is imposing Magnitsky sanctions on the regime's oligarchs. This is a really important step because that will start to cause fragmentation within the Islamic Republic. Why? Just like Putin's regime, the Islamic Republic is a kleptocratic, oligarchic, corrupt system to its core. While you have clerics, you have IRGC commanders violently enforcing a hardline Islamist order on the Iranian people, killing women for showing a bit of hair, their sons, their daughters, their families, the Aghazadehs, as we call them in Farsi, they live lavish lifestyles in Paris, London, Berlin, in cities like Toronto. enforcing Magnitsky sanctions that target these individuals, freezing their bank accounts, imposing travel bans, taking their passports away and not refusing them entry, that's a really important step that the Iranian people have been calling for as well. And thirdly, these are just three off the top of my head. Third, prescription of the IRGC. The IRGC is not solely, but is the main vehicle for repression inside the Islamic Republic. It's undertaking terrorist operations against the people of Iran, people in the Middle East, and people in Europe and America. So those three measures would significantly weaken the Islamic Republic. On the other side, ensuring the Iranian people have a internet supply, that is an essential lifeline. That's the way we can get messages outside of Iran and a constant flow of information. It also enables Iranians inside of Iran who are in the protest to communicate with each other. Again, that's another mechanism. Another one before I stop, because I can continue. A strike fund. A strike fund. We have seen the Islamic Republic has frozen assets abroad, in Europe, in America, across the world. The West could work together to use those frozen assets as a strike fund to support the Iranian families, the brave men and women who are refusing to go to work, who are striking as a means to protest against this totalitarian, misogynistic, authoritarian regime. So there's some policy options the West can take. So far, we've seen limited sanctions. Yes, they're important, but in terms of practical effect, hit them where it hurts. Yeah, hit them where it hurts. Go for their money. Go for their families' money in Europe, in the West.
So let's say, with that very generous menu you've given, let's say that the West will do that and the regime will be weakened, and let's say that it might collapse, potentially. What then? Because, for example, we had Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi visit Israel recently and last week for Holocaust Memorial Day, which was a very strong symbol of the support of what you mentioned, the people of Iran, in difference with the regime itself. What then? Is the Shah going to come back? Is Crown Prince going to be back? Is that what do you do then?
The thing to really, really underscore, and that was such an important trip, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi's trip to Israel gave us a glimpse of what life would be like post-Islamic Republic. If the Islamic Republic, I'm not even going to say if, because it will. We're not even at the if stage anymore. I think the consensus is when. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. When the Islamic Republic collapses, this will be the single most liberating thing, not only for the people of Iran, not only for the region, but for the stability and peace across the world. The Iranian people have undergone unprecedented secularization over the years. This secularization began in the early 1990s, and it has expanded. We have got some polling data on that I can share. I will share with you, Daniel, to circulate. And it shows that not only do the people of Iran reject the Islamic Republic, but actually we've seen a decline of religion in the Islamic Republic. Under 25% identify as Shia Muslim. We see that the Iranian people overwhelmingly support liberal, secular values. They want a secular, liberal state. That is the Iran we will see after the Islamic Republic goes. After the Islamic Republic, I have no doubt, and all the signs are there. What we saw with Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi's trip to Israel, we will see Israel and Iran once again become partners. There is a lot of support Israel can give Iran in terms of environmental support, particularly in relation to water. There's a huge water crisis in Iran. And I think that just like the Abraham Accords, by the way, until we got to the Abraham Accords, we had a process by which behind the scenes, there were parties, there were delegations working together, preparing a plan for when that moment happens. The same should happen in relation to Iran, because this moment will happen. We will have Osiris Accords. I have no doubt about that. And we see that the people of Iran, the youth of Iran, look at the Abraham Accords, look across the Persian Gulf and say, why can't we have that? That's also why, by the way, the more countries that join the Abraham Accords, the more countries that normalize relations with Israel, that is one of the biggest and most effective ways to undermine the IRGC's project and the Islamic Republic's project. It's this China brokered agreement from the IRGC's perspective and from Khamenei's perspective, its sole objective is to disrupt peace between the Arab states and Israel and undermine the Abraham Accords. So more normalization is a really, really effective way to counter the Islamic Republic's destructive project across the Middle East.
So let's say for you in the UK or Europe, what the UK or Europe's role should be in the question of Abraham Accords, or even getting closer to other countries in the region? What do you think Europeans should do?
Well, I think the Europeans and the Americans really should take it seriously. They should put full support and full attention to this. If there is a desire to pivot to the Indo-Pacific, we have to ensure that the region has the right mechanisms and is in a place for this pivot to the Indo-Pacific. My personal opinion is that you can't pivot away. You can certainly pivot to the Indo-Pacific, but you can't forget about the Middle East. So supporting.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go.
So in that aspect, the Saudis and Iranians are now getting closer, and there were lots of talks about potentially Israel's and Saudis getting closer as well. What do you think now, if in the context of the IRGC, Iranian's regime, everything that you've just said, how do you put that all together?
I think we have to, again, let's observe and analyze what the Islamic Republic and Khamenei's and IRGC's motivations were in entering that normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia, right? It's not a peace agreement. It's not a peace in the region that's, upon first glance, yes, it looks like it'll bring stability to the region and kind of global security. But if you dig deeper and look at Khamenei and the IRGC's objectives, it's the opposite to that. The Saudis are well aware of this. The Saudis, beyond Shamkhani's smiling face, Shamkhani, the IRGC commander who led those negotiations, the Saudis know the true identity of the IRGC.
So let me ask you this. Do you think the Saudis can now be a tool for the West in order to have some sort of leverage on Iran?
I mean, I wouldn't frame it in that way. What I would say is that the Biden administration has demonstrated with great skill how it can bring coalitions and alliances, its traditional alliances, together, and we've seen that in Ukraine. We need to see that in the Middle East. We need to see that in the Middle East, and that needs to be the focal point for the Biden administration. They've done a fantastic job at building and maintaining alliances when it comes to Ukraine. They need to do the same in the Middle East. The IRGC, from the perspective of the IRGC, this agreement has no substance to it. In the short term, what they will do is, at the very best, delay their hostility towards Saudi Arabia to focus on expelling their greater enemy from the region, the US, and to pivot more attention on Israel. But in the long run, the IRGC believes that this China brokered deal will further increase its plausible deniability when it comes to attacks into Saudi Arabia via Ansar Allah, the Houthis. So, and as I said, in its doctrine, again, I've looked at the IRGC's textbooks and what they're teaching their recruits. They refer to the Al Saud family as coming from Jewish descent, quote, Jewish descent. They say that they are imposters in Islam. They were positioned there by the Brits, and they're not Muslim, they're of Jewish heritage, and they are ideologically, they call for hostility towards the Al Saud family. Khomeini once famously said that even if I negotiate peace with Saddam Hussein, who they were at war with, I'll never negotiate peace with the Al Saud family. So hostility towards Saudi Arabia is in the IRGC's DNA, similarly to its hostility towards Israel.
Talk about,
That's not going to go anywhere. And I think Riyadh is very, very aware of that. But for Riyadh, they're focusing on their modernization program, and at best, from their perspective, this delays any confrontation and gives them the space to pursue their modernization program, Vision 2030.
talk about the IRGC DNA that you mentioned. We've received a comment from Joan Ryan that I believe you know. She says about that are those not least in position of power who say that we should not prescribe the IRGC because they are a state actor. And in that aspect, then you lose some sort of access to information or negotiations or ability to have diplomatic channels.
Yeah.
If you differentiate that from Hamas or Hezbollah.
Sure.
What do you make?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. And it's one that I often get. The IRGC is not a conventional armed force. It is not a force that's bound by Iran's borders. It's made it very clear that it doesn't have Iran in its name. It's called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The commanders itself have been very clear, Iran is not in our name. They do not recognize the territorial borders of Iran. The indoctrination papers explicitly say that we divide the world between the Dar al-Islam and the Dar al-Kufr, the land of Muslims and the land of infidels, like other Islamist extremist organizations. Now, so the IRGC itself doesn't recognize itself as being attached to the state of Iran. But even if we're to say it's part of the Iranian state, ignoring what how the IRGC identifies as, this would be a strong argument had Hezbollah not been prescribed in the UK. The prescription of Hezbollah is technically, in theory, part of the Lebanese state. You have Hezbollah entrenched in the government across the ministries. However, the UK government rightly recognized that despite being a part of the Lebanese state, Hezbollah itself is a violent Islamist extremist organization that warrants being on the terrorist list. It prescribed Hezbollah on the basis that it sought, quote, armed resistance against the state of Israel and that it supports terrorist groups in Palestinian territories and in Iraq. The IRGC does exactly that. In fact, the reason Hezbollah does that was because it's embraced the IRGC's ideology. So just as the prescription of Hezbollah hasn't prevented the UK's engagement with the Lebanese state, the prescription of the IRGC will not prevent the diplomatic engagement with the Islamic Republic. Rather, it sends a clear message to Ayatollah Khamenei that terrorism and militancy pursued by the IRGC will not be tolerated. So far, we're not sending that message out. And in turn, we're seeing greater escalation by the IRGC. So if anyone ever says that argument, the response is Hezbollah. Hezbollah set a precedent. If Hezbollah wasn't on the list, it would be very different. But Hezbollah is on the list, rightly so, and the IRGC should be too.
Noted. Before we come to a close, I'd like to ask you one more question. The diminishing role of the US, as we mentioned, in the Middle East, and I don't remember in who wrote this, but they said that Biden is hiding from the US, is hiding from the Middle East, but the Middle East always knows on which door to knock. Do you think, and you mentioned before, like that they managed to create alliances and bring back NATO, for example, in Europe. Do you think a country in Europe, or for example, as the UK after Brexit, that is a bit more free, can lead some sort of movement within the Middle East to play some sort of, either from the Abraham Accords or for policies against Iran and like to change a little bit?
I mean, I think we should. Whether we will is a different question, but I think we should, and I think Britain is in a unique opportunity and a unique position to do that, to act as the bridge between Europe and the US. What's really, really important, I think Ukraine showed this, is that we need a transatlantic policy to confronting our challenges and the threats against us, the way we live, our values, etc. And the Islamic Republic is one of those primary challenges, one of those primary threats. Countering, for example, weapons proliferation. The Islamic Republic is the proliferation of Iranian weapons is a major threat. We're seeing this now in Sudan. Iranian weapons are being used. something the IRGC is boasting about, by the way. We're seeing Iranian drones, the IRGC's drones being fired into European soil. So first and foremost, I think that Britain can and should lead efforts to impose a new countering proliferation regime on the Islamic Republic, and it can lead efforts. So yes, in response to that, I think Britain has a unique role to play. But what's absolutely central is that there is a unified transatlantic policy. Khamenei's objective from the time he took the mantle of supreme leader in 1989 was the West without the US, because obviously the US is its ideological enemy. It's only until recently that we saw the gulf between Europe and the US that from his perspective, he's been able to achieve that. We need to make sure that we have a unified approach, a consolidated approach, and that's absolutely critical, both to weaken the Islamic Republic and to support the Iranian people. I go back to that. The single biggest asset the West has in the fight against the Islamic Republic is the Iranian people. The Iranian people want this regime out. They are bravely risking, just like the Ukrainians, they are on the front lines, risking absolutely everything to get rid of this regime. And as I said, the collapse of the Islamic Republic will be the single most liberating thing, not just for Iran, not just for region, but for global stability.